Brother Allen texted me today. He said he was sorry he would miss. He sure hates to miss. So, he'd be here if he could. We do have new memory verses for January 2025. I guess we could read those together. I put them on the prayer sheet. You want to do them? So we will read these together. You ready? 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5. All right, we've got 5 Wednesdays to work on those, except the 5th Wednesday we will be starting our mission conference. But we got 4 weeks to work on those, and some of those may be easier than others. Pastor said that next month the verses are going to be easier. They're going to be from the first song. So maybe I can handle those. I'm going to try to handle these. I finally got Romans 12, 9 through 12 just about right. If I could just remember rejoicing in hope. Miss Joanne kept trying to remind me. We're going to sing number 406. 406, sing them over again to me, wonderful words of life. Sing them over again to me, wonderful words of life. Let me more of their beauty see, wonderful words of life. Words of life and beauty, teach me faith and duty. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Christ the Blessed One gives to all wonderful words of life. Sinner, listen to the loving call, wonderful words of life. Also freely given, wooing us to heaven. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Sweetly echo the gospel call, wonderful words of life. Offer pardon and peace to all, wonderful words of life. Jesus only Savior, sanctify forever. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life.
He made the ocean with only a tear, the sound of his voice made dry land appear. He sculpted the mountains with such great skill, but when he made Calvary, it was more than just a hill, more than a mountain where thieves were crucified. It became a fountain for the thirsty and dry. And when he cried, "It's finished," all heaven stood still. But when he made Calvary, it was more than just a hill. I was condemned. He took my place. I was in sin, my sins erased. He cried, "Father, it's finished," while his blood spilled. My God signed my pardon on Calvary's hill. More than a mountain where thieves were crucified, it became a fountain for the thirsty and dry. And when he cried, "It's finished," all heaven stood still. My God signed my pardon on Calvary's hill. 'Cause when he made Calvary, it was more than just a hill. We're going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 this evening. It's evening. I guess I could just look out the window out there and tell it's not morning, unless it's early morning. But if it's that early, I'm probably still in bed. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 is our memory work for this month. And I wanted to look at the first 3 verses of this chapter, which the first 2 verses are not part of our memory work, but they are part of the chapter. And just to give y'all a little bit of a sneak preview of what we're going to be preaching on, Lord willing, in the next month or so, I really want to focus in on the next few months, really, on the idea of tearing down strongholds. And really, I want to focus on the idea of what strongholds are in our lives. There are good strongholds and there are bad strongholds that we can have in our lives. And the stronghold mentioned in verse number 4 here is a bad one. And that's what we're going to focus on first, is the tearing down of those bad strongholds. And then once we get through all of those, then we're going to be looking at the kind of strongholds we need to replace them with. Because you can't tear something down and then not replace it. You got to have something in place of that sin. If you're going to get sin out of your life and just leave a void, then you become like a cardboard box where when you step on that and doesn't have anything in it, it has no strength to it, it just crumples. And we don't want to be that. We want to make sure that we are filling that void that is left by the sin that we are casting out and filling it with the gospel, filling it with godliness, and filling it with good things. And this Sunday morning, we're going to be looking at one of those ways, the weapons of our warfare. We're going to be looking at that in 2 Chronicles chapter 20 on Sunday morning. And so that's what we're going to be looking at on Sunday morning. But I want to look at this intro to this chapter. This is right in the middle. I say middle, it's pretty close to the end here of 2 Corinthians. And This book of Corinthians, really both books of Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, are harsh letters, which he alludes to in verse 2. We're going to get to that here in a second. These are very harsh letters to a church. And Paul spends the first 2 verses really talking about that harshness and talking about the boldness that he had in writing, which as I was reading this, I couldn't help but think about Twitter, Facebook, social media, all these different things where it's easy for somebody to get onto the computer and type away and start attacking people on the computer, but then when you're face to face, it's a little bit harder. And that's something that Paul is going to talk about here in verse number 2 when we get to it. But one of the things that Paul is mentioning about this, and one of the other things I couldn't help but think of as I was reading and studying this, is Colossians chapter 4, where Paul tells the Colossian believers, he tells them to let your conversation be always with grace, seasoned with salt. And that's kind of the implication here. So I want to read these first 3 verses, and then we'll look a little bit at what he's saying here, and then we'll get into verses 3 is where the main message is. Verse number 1, it says, "Now I, Paul, myself, beseech you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am base among you, but being absent am bold towards you." Again, there's that, when I'm away from you, I can be bold towards you. But when I'm in your presence, I'm a little bit more meek. I'm not that rambunctious kind of person who's going to attack you, which this is something, if you've read the rest of 2 Corinthians, even in the first couple of chapters, he makes it a point to point out, look, I made you sorry with the letter, he tells them. I made you guys sorry with that first letter that I sent you where I was attacking your sin. And he says that he wasn't sorry about that. He wasn't sorry because it brought about repentance. It brought about what he was expecting it to bring about. But at the same time, as harsh as Paul was in these letters, it's really hard on paper to get your heart across. And I think that's where Paul's heart is. Read verse number 2. "But I beseech you that I may not be bold when I'm present with you, that confidence, when I'm present with that confidence, wherewith I think to be bold against some, which think of us as though we walked according to the flesh, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh." In these first 2 verses, he's really talking about his conversation. He's talking about the way he talks to people. And I think this is a very practical, just these 2 verses are very practical in today's day and age, as I already mentioned, with social media and all these different things where it's easy for somebody to attack somebody with the anonymity of the internet. You can get onto Twitter, you can get onto all these social media companies, and you don't even have to put your real name down. You can put a fake name down, and then nobody ever knows it was you saying these things, and you can say all kinds of harsh things. But when it comes down to it, when you're face to face, then you have to stand behind your words. And Paul here, he's not really trying to say that, look, when I'm talking to you on a letter, I'm going to be more bold because I'm hateful towards you. That's not the case at all. What it is that he's understanding that in the letter, it's harder for him to get across his heart. He says here, he's really pointing out the idea that tact is important. I want to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, because we're going to see a little bit of this as he addressed the Corinthians in their first letter. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he kind of alludes to this, the idea of tactfulness and understanding the context of where he's at. When he's far away in a prison and he is writing a letter, there are certain freedoms that he has that he doesn't necessarily have in person, because in person he wants to show more of his heart. He wants to show more of his love towards them and wants to show more of his grace. And really the hope is that by this letter of boldness, by this letter of pointing out the sin of them, that by the time he gets to them in person, he doesn't have to be bold. He doesn't have to be harsh with them. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he talks about this tactfulness. The 1 Corinthians chapter 9 is a passage where he talks about how pastors, preachers, missionaries, and all of those who serve in the ministry, the Bible makes it very clear that they ought to live off of the ministry. There's nothing wrong with a pastor being paid, but then he makes it a point in this same passage to point out that he didn't get paid. And it wasn't because he didn't have the right to get paid. He was doing it because he was more concerned about being tactful, because his mission, his goal of salvation of others was more important to him than pay. I don't want to take a whole time looking at this chapter here, because what I really want to get to is what he says in verses 18 down to 23. But what he's talking about here is that it's not wrong for a missionary, for a preacher to get paid, but it is wrong for a missionary or a preacher to expect to get paid. And that is something that he is trying to get across here. And so I want to read verse 18 through 23, and this is where we're going to tie this into 2 Corinthians chapter 10 here in a minute. He says, "What is my reward then? Verily, that when I preach the gospel, I make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. For though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself servant unto all, that I might gain the more." What he's saying here is, look, I have the freedom. I could expect y'all to take to take up an offering and provide for me, because I'm sacrificing all this time, and I have the freedom given me by God, who has said that those who preach the gospel ought to live of the gospel, is what he says in a previous verse. But what he's saying is, I'm not doing that, because what's more important to me is I would rather save even more people, or have even more people listen to me, by removing that potential stumbling block. He's willing to sacrifice even more. And then he gets to verses 20 through 23, which I think has been misinterpreted by a lot of people. But what he is really getting at is the tactfulness here. He says, "And unto the Jews I become as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. To them that are without the law, as without the law." And then there's this parenthetical that people leave out all the time, where he says, "Being not without the law of God, but under the law to Christ." He's saying, I'm not going to sit here. I'm not going to compromise my doctrine, and I'm not going to live in sin. I am still under the law of Christ. But then he says that I might gain them that are without the law. To the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I am made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. There's the goal there, is that he wants to save people. And obviously it's not him saving them, it's that God is saving them, but God is saving them through the foolishness of preaching, is what he says at the beginning of 1 Corinthians, that the foolishness of preaching is how God saves people, and he doesn't want to get in the way of that. And when it comes to our speech, when it comes to the way we communicate with people, when it comes to the way that we talk to people, we ought to be careful about the way that we talk to people. When we get to talking about pulling down strongholds in the next couple of weeks and in the next few months, we're going to be talking about pulling down strongholds and getting rid of sin, not only in our lives, but making sure that we are surrounding ourselves by godly things so that we don't fall prey to that sin that is around us. There's a temptation there that we can become harsh with other people, and we can become harsh with those who don't necessarily pull down those strongholds and who aren't as spiritual as we may seem to be, or as we may think that we are. And this goes to Romans chapter 14, which we don't have time to look at as well. But when it comes to pulling down of strongholds, we need to make sure that while we understand where to pull down those strongholds, we also need to be understanding of the way that we are communicating with other people. We need to make sure that we still have grace in our communication. And Paul here was more concerned with the goal of winning some to Christ and pulling people. And the illustration that he gives is, look, to the Jews, I'm become as a Jew. To those without the law, I'm become without the law. And he has that parenthetical to put that into today's context. Let's say you have somebody who maybe, I've worked under a pastor who did not think that it was right for women to wear pants. And I personally don't hold that conviction. My wife wears pants, but obviously not tight pants, not the kind of pants that are leggings and those kind of things. But I've worked under people who have that strong conviction about that, and I'm not going to have my wife come around that person in pants. Not because I think there's anything wrong with it, but because there's no point in trying to cause some kind of a controversy. I had a friend who didn't like going to Starbucks because they support homosexuality and they support abortion and all those different things. And you can go down a rabbit trail of all of those things, but Walmart does the same thing. And the way I look at it is, I'm not going to sit there and drink a Starbucks drink in front of that person just to taunt them. I'll sacrifice a little bit because I'm going to become all things to all men, as long as it's not against the Bible, as long as I'm not compromising my doctrines, as long as I'm not compromising my beliefs. I shouldn't put a stumbling block in front of somebody. And so going back to our text here in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, what Paul is talking about here is, look, I am meek and gentle in Christ. And in the presence of you, I am base among you, but being absent, I am bold towards you. I've got some tact. I understand the context of the times when I'm with you. It's a little bit different than when I'm writing a letter to you, but I beseech you. He says, look, my goal is not to be harsh with you. My goal is not to be bold. But he's actually begging that for their sakes, that he might not be bold when he's present with them. That confidence, wherewith I think to be bold against some, which think of us as having walked after the flesh. What he's saying there is some people think that, hey, you're just doing that because you want to attack somebody, and when you're with us, you don't want to get into a fight, and so now you're changing your ways. And what he's saying is, I'm not changing my ways because I don't want to get into a fight. I'm changing my approach to things because now that I'm with you, I really want to get in and be able to talk to you one-on-one, and I want to show the love of Christ because he understands. And then we get into our text, verse number 3, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. What he is talking about here is the goal of warring against sin, warring against all of these different things, which the Corinthian church, they had a lot of sins in the church. And some of these sins were very serious sins. Some of these sins were sins that I couldn't even imagine being in a church, and yet they were in this church of Corinth, and Paul had to address some of these sins, and his goal was not to just attack them just for the sake of attacking them and getting into a fight, but when he gets with them, his goal is restoration, his goal is love, his goal is grace, and he understands that he's not here for a fight, he's here for restoration, he's here for their spiritual good, and he's understanding that the war that he is fighting is not a physical fight. He's not after a physical fight. He's not wanting to come to blows with them. He's wanting to come to Christ with them. And he's understanding that the warfare that they are warring is not a physical warfare, but it is a spiritual warfare, and that's what he wants to focus on. And when it comes to our communication with other people, when we are sharing the gospel with people, which is something that I hope we do even more of in 2025. This is the first day of the year in 2025, and I hope and pray that this is the first of many where we get an opportunity to share the gospel with other people. I pray that if you haven't had an opportunity today, I pray that you have an opportunity tomorrow to share the gospel with somebody. But as we do that, the temptation for us, and the temptation for me even, especially for me, is to come down on somebody and really tell them, how bad sin is, because that's the message of the gospel. But when we do that, we need to make sure we are also offering the grace and showing them the whole gospel and not just the part of the gospel. Yes, there's bad news involved in it. Without that bad news, you can't even get to the good news. But we need to make sure that our communication is with grace seasoned with salt, as Colossians chapter 4 says. We need to make sure that we are tactful with the way that we are approaching people, whether we're talking to unsaved people or whether we're talking to saved people. We need to have some tactfulness about us and understand that the weapons of our warfare are not physical. We're not looking to start fights with people, but we have a spiritual warfare about us. And this goes to another aspect of it, that as we are in the world, the world is going to continue to act like the world. We can't expect the world to act like Christians. This is something that Paul even told the Corinthians back in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And I'm going to turn there real quick. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he makes a statement here. He says earlier in verse number 9, he says, I wrote unto you in an epistle not to company with fornicators, not to company with people who are in sexual sin, yet not altogether with fornicators of this world, or with covetous, or extortioners, or of idolaters, for then you must needs go out of the world. He's saying, look, I told you earlier, don't have contact with people who are in sin, and he names off some sins. But then he says, but not altogether, because otherwise you got to go out of the world, because everybody's going to be in sin. And so then he clarifies it and says in verse 11, but now I have written you to not keep company if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator or covetous. What he's doing in that passage is he is pointing out the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, they are spiritual. And when it comes to the world is going to live one way, and we can't sit there and expect the world to act like Christians. We need to be understanding of that, but it doesn't mean that we compromise, but it means that as we are in the world, we ought to be sharing the gospel with them and not trying to pick some physical fight with them, but instead, let's talk about spiritual things to them. Let's share the gospel with them. Let's show them what it is that is wrong about them, and not just attack them and not just try and boycott them and try and get away from them. But God is calling us not to be hermits. He's telling us we need to be in the world, as James says in James chapter 1. At the very end of that chapter, he says, pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is to help the fatherless and the widows and to keep himself unspotted from the world. And the word unspotted there is the same idea of that we use when we think about waterproof devices. I was talking to our Sunday school class about this. I have a waterproof phone, where the phone is waterproof, not completely, but I can drop it into a pool, or I can drop it into a bathtub or something. If I pull it out in time enough, the water doesn't get into the battery. It's waterproof. And an unspotted Christian is one who is in the world, but the world doesn't get into him. And the world is not getting into him, and he is protected from that world. Yes, he's in the world, and he should be in the world, but we shouldn't be affected by the world. We should be affecting the world, and not in a physical way, but in a spiritual way, because the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but spiritual. And the weapons that we have, they can tear down strongholds, and we're going to be looking at some of those in the coming weeks, looking at these strongholds that God wants us to pull down, and some of those are in our memory work, some of those are past our memory work, and I would encourage you to read this whole chapter. But what I want to encourage us is that the start of this chapter, as we begin to look at this subject of tearing down strongholds, he starts off the chapter by reminding them that even among Christians, there needs to be some tactfulness. We don't just need to come in with guns blazing trying to attack somebody. We need to understand where they're coming from, not compromising, but preaching the gospel with love. As Paul would tell Timothy, he says, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and doctrine. Don't give up the doctrine. Don't give up the beliefs. Don't compromise. But make sure you have some patience, have some long suffering. And I pray that each of us, as we go throughout the year 2025, that we would have patience with those that we are sharing the gospel with, that those that we are approaching about sin, that we would have some patience with them without compromising, but that we would still show some love and compassion towards them. Let our communications be with grace, seasoned with salt. And I keep on saying that. I'm not sure that that's the exact quote. I encourage you to go read Colossians chapter 4. I believe it's verse 6 talks about that. But I want to encourage you, let's let our conversation be with grace, seasoned with salt. Let's go ahead and bow our heads, and we'll have a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Lord, I thank you for this evening that you've given us. Lord, I pray that you would be with those who are not able to be here, Lord, for health reasons, and others. Lord, I pray that you would just work in those situations. God, I pray that you would be with our shut-ins, God, that you would help them, Lord, that you would give them encouragement. Lord, I pray that you would be with all the prayer requests that were mentioned earlier, Lord. We come here on Wednesday nights to lift up these requests, Lord, and I pray that we wouldn't forget them, Lord, even though we've had a chance to look in your word, Lord. I pray that we wouldn't forget our needs, Lord, that we have here, and that we would continue to lift those up to you. Lord, I do pray that as we go throughout this year, Lord, and we look at your word, Lord, I pray that each of us would have a compassion and a love in our heart for people, Lord, that we would have a compassion and a love for the unsaved and for the saved alike, Lord, and that we would show that in our communications, in our conversations, Lord, whether we're absent or in their presence, Lord. I pray that we would show the compassion that comes from you, Lord, and we thank you for it. I pray that you would be with each of us as we go our separate ways.
Thank you.